Would you harbor me? Would I harbor you? Universalism has harbored many. It has a message of love beyond belief, of a great love that embraces all. This is the message that John Murray heard when Universalism harbored him. Now, many of you know the mythic tale of how John Murray became the official leader of Universalism in the Americas. But for those who don't, Murray was a Methodist minister in England in the mid-1700s with a promising career. He had strong Calvinist views, but upon moving to London from Ireland, he came across the renegade Welsh preacher called James Relly, who was preaching at the time a heretical message of universal salvation. At first, he rejected Relly's ideas, but over time, he became intrigued by them. But soon, Murray experienced a series of back-to-back tragedies. His only son died in infancy, followed closely by his wife's passing. Then 4 of his siblings also died. John was devastated and suicidal, grieving so deeply. And then adding insult to injury, he was thrown into debtor's prison for not meeting his financial obligations. Fortunately, his brother-in-law bailed him out. While racked with profound grief from those tragedies, feeling wretched, Murray came across a traveler from America. This chance meeting gave him a new possibility, and he decided to set out for the new world to start over. The myth goes that Murray had visionary dreams while on board his ship, the Hand in Hand, to the new world. In the dreams, God appeared to him and told him that despite his sins and tragedies, God still loved him, that he was worthy in the eyes of God, that he received a message of universal salvation. And for those of you who have difficulty with the word God, I invite you to translate it to the word love today, because that is what universalism is all about. So upon finally reaching the new world after the Atlantic crossing, Murray's ship ran aground on a sandbank in New Jersey called, ironically, Good Luck Point. Nearby, a man by the name of Thomas Potter had built a new chapel to host itinerant ministers, the traveling ministers who didn't have a fixed parish settlement. When he by chance came across John Murray and heard his story, Potter invited him to preach. But Murray gave an emphatic no. He'd forsworn the ministry. John wanted nothing more to do with it. He was done. Potter, however, longing for someone to speak in his beautiful new sanctuary, made a deal with him. He said that if Murray's ship was still aground on Sunday, he would have to preach in Potter's new chapel. Well, the winds did not change, and the ship did not set sail by Sunday. So according to legend, Murray did indeed preach in Potter's chapel. And he preached a powerful message of an all-loving God, as had come to him in his dreams on his passage. In fact, his sermon was so popular and so inspiring that even though he continued to New York on the ship the next day when the wind came up again, Murray soon returned to New Jersey at Potter's invitation. And this launched his career as a Universalist evangelist throughout the Northeast. He traveled widely, spreading this controversial message of a God who loved and forgave all. Eventually, Murray remarried and settled at a parish in Boston. And he died as the great apostle of Universalism in 1815. In fact, Universalists mark that auspicious day in New Jersey, September 30th, 1770, as the official beginning of Universalism, even though other Europeans, including George de Benneville, had already brought this message of universal salvation to the world. Many of you will know the name de Benneville from the camp we just went to as a congregation up in the mountains. Universalism also harbored Hosea Ballou, who you heard about in our story earlier. Born in 1771, the year after Murray arrived in New York, Hosea Ballou was the 11th child of a Calvinist Baptist minister living in New Hampshire. Ballou was just 19 years old when he attended a Baptist revival meeting in 1889 to get baptized, I'm having trouble with my words this morning, to get baptized and cleansed of his sin. Since Calvinist theology proclaimed the predestination of the elect, in which God chose only a few, I think you heard earlier, 1 in 1,000 to be saved, and he condemned everyone else to eternal hell, apparently, Ballou and his friends were scared and wanted to do all that they could to save themselves from damnation. Everyone lived in fear of this judgmental God who would surely damn them. I mean, the chances weren't good. So people were arriving in droves to get baptized and hopefully win that lucky lottery ticket and be one of the few chosen to receive God's grace and mercy. As Ballou stepped forward to be baptized, he noticed something that surprised him. He didn't feel fear, and he didn't feel like a horrible sinner. Later, in a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I was much troubled in my mind because I thought I didn't stand in such fear of the divine wrath as I ought to do, or as others had done before they found acceptance with God." And thus began his questioning of the Calvinist doctrine. Upon returning home from this experience, Ballou began to read the Bible in earnest. He particularly looked for what the Bible actually said about sin and damnation. Reason and rationality were important to Ballou in interpreting the Bible, and the Baptist preachers had declared that all sinners would be condemned to hell. But as Ballou reread and reflected upon the Bible, it led him to see a different God. Hosea saw that the text revealed a universally loving God, a God who would not condemn humans to hell. Ballou began to theorize that the concept of hell perhaps was entirely created by humans. Humans created their own living hell on earth through their misdeeds and their suffering. But God, the God of his newfound understanding, was actually all loving. When he confessed his universalist ideas to his father, Hosea was promptly excommunicated from the Baptist church, his father having no mercy on his son. Nevertheless, Ballou was soon after ordained as an itinerant Universalist minister, and he was inspired to preach the idea that God is a being of eternal love who seeks the happiness of his human children. And as a result, there was nothing to fear. Religion without fear was a radical concept for the puritanical culture of the time. In fact, it's even radical today to suggest that our own inner quest for happiness could be a moral compass. Ballou's research and prayers further led him to understand God as one, not three different entities, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So with this realization, Hosea, interestingly enough, also foreshadowed the burgeoning Unitarian beliefs and digressed from John Murray's kind of universalism. In 1805, Ballou published his radical work, A Treatise on Atonement, explaining that Jesus did not need to die to atone for humanity's sins, but rather, Jesus came to reveal God's love in human form. Since God was all-powerful and all-loving, Ballou thought that he didn't need to create a system of punishment as put forth by Calvinism. Hosea was bitterly disparaged for this absolutely radical theology. It was completely contrary to what was being espoused at the time as true Christianity, and threatened the power of the church to control its people. But that didn't stop Baloo. He held firm to his convictions and continued to spread his message of hope, of harbor, and of liberation for another 50 years around New England. Now let's jump 200 years into the future. When Bishop Carlton Pearson, the hugely successful African-American bishop of a 6,000 plus member Pentecostalist megachurch in Tulsa, Oklahoma, had a crisis of faith, Universalism harbored him too. Bishop Pearson was renowned throughout the country as an acclaimed preacher, singer, and founder of the Higher Dimensions Center. He was the protege of the famous evangelist Oral Roberts. His Pentecostalist pews were filled every week with ardent believers. Pearson preached the gospel with the judgmental message that we're all sinners and need to be saved from our sins, or we'll surely go to eternal damnation in hell. Then one night, he too had an epiphany, his own message from God. After watching a documentary on the genocide in Rwanda and wondering about the fate of non-Christians around the world, Pearson supposedly heard the voice of God talking to him. The voice said that no one, whether a believer or not, would be damned to eternal torment in hell. Everyone would be saved, everyone. All of those people suffering throughout the world, whether sinners or destitute, whether Christians or not, whether believers or not, were loved equally by God. Pearson also wrestled with the fact that his uncle was imprisoned and had asked for his forgiveness. But Pearson refused to forgive him for his wrongdoings, knowing that he would go to hell. But when the uncle died a few months later, alone and unforgiven in prison, Pearson began to wonder and regret his decision. Reading Lamentations, he found evidence in the Bible of a forgiving, all-loving God. It said, "For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love." Like Hosea Ballou, Pearson began to believe hell was created on earth by our own misdeeds, rather than being a place of suffering in the afterlife, and that God accepted us all into his arms eventually. And he began to call this doctrine universal reconciliation, meaning that all would eventually be reconciled with God, no matter what. Does this theology sound familiar to you? Of course. These are the fundamental building blocks of our own Universalist faith, a universally loving God who does not condemn anyone. Pearson also started preaching the gospel of universal inclusion, a message of salvation for all, including non-Christians and LGBTQ folk. Now you can imagine how his Pentecostal congregation, his colleagues, and how Oral Roberts reacted to this major shift in his message. It was brutal. Roberts was particularly devastated as Carlton Pearson was his hand-picked successor and his surrogate son, after Roberts' own son had committed suicide after not being accepted by his family for being gay. Branded a heretic by his peers and ousted from his faith, Pearson went through many years of feeling utterly lost, yet still convicted that God was all-loving. And then 10 years ago, in 2008, after having lost his church building and most of his congregation, Bishop Pearson found safe harbor and welcome at the All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, our only Unitarian Universalist megachurch. Reverend Carlton's message, his mission now, is to reclaim, recover, and inspire radically inclusive love on this planet. And the new Netflix movie, Come Sunday, documents Bishop Pearson's remarkable transformation. Michael and I thoroughly enjoyed the film, but were disappointed that it didn't show his eventual partnership with Unitarian Universalism. But I had the wonderful opportunity to meet Carlton at this year's General Assembly, and it was delightful to see his joy and passion for the Universalist message firsthand. The mission of All Souls Tulsa is love beyond belief. This mission is based on a theology advanced by UU theologian Reverend Tandeka, who wrote a book, Love Beyond Belief. Now, she has developed a program for congregations to embrace a theology of love beyond belief and envisions hundreds of congregations around the country guided by this theology. Tandeka says, a religious community can teach its members how to hate beyond belief or how to love beyond belief. Universalism teaches us how to love beyond belief. We come together across many different beliefs and theologies, all the way from atheism to Zen. But we are united by love. What we believe is less important than how we love. Reverend Dr. Marlon Lavenhar, another esteemed colleague of mine and the senior minister at All Souls, talks about the 3 C's of love beyond belief: connection, compassion, and courage. Connection, compassion, and courage. If we're doing all 3, he says, we're on the path of living from love. He writes, at All Souls, love is at the center of our church, and we feel strongly that people do not have to believe alike to love alike. Do not have to believe alike to love alike. The only test of faith, he says, that we will encounter at All Souls is, do your beliefs or lack of beliefs lead you to love others? So I ask you, do your beliefs or lack of beliefs lead you to love others? Do they lead you to love more? Because that is what we are called to do by our Universalist faith. We are called to forgive. We are called to try again. We are called to show compassion. We are called to seek pardon. We are called to be mindful of our own shadow, of our own imperfection and brokenness, so that we can extend compassion to others when we see it. We are called to have courage to confront that which is unloving. We are called to open our arms again and again, as hard as it may be, especially in these times. And we are called to begin again in love. To begin again in love, my friends, again and again with each new day. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this isn't easy. It's challenging work. And love knows I fail at this again and again. Sometimes it's easier to hate than to love, especially when it's so abundantly modeled in our society. It doesn't require more than having a primal reaction. And it's also easier to judge than to empathize. It's easier to push away than to embrace. But I'm committed to a return to love. Now, you don't have to love certain behaviors in others to love the person. They may do all kinds of things that irritate you, that make you angry, and that you disapprove of. But just like we say to our children, I don't like that behavior, but I love you. Our faith calls us to keep loving the essence of another human being, even if their actions dismay us. If we keep looking to love to guide us, if we look honestly within ourselves to acknowledge the shadow that lives within every single one of us, then we can only have compassion for this ailing world. This ailing world that all too easily distracts us from love, that all too easily has us close our hearts and condemn one another. All too easily has us forget the core of love that lives deep within each of us. So, my friends, will you join me in creating more love? Will you join me in creating more love? Yes. Now, these are not rhetorical questions I ask. Will you join me in offering safe harbor to one another when we're lost and at sea? Yes. Will you join me in looking for the seed of love in everyone, even when it seems hard to find? Yes. Will you join me in loving across difference? Yes. Will you join me in valuing love beyond belief? So as you have answered the Universalist call of love today, may it be so. Amen.